Welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this program, where we try to help develop some additional insight into the characters who occupy and surround state government here in our capital in Salem. I shouldn't say characters, I should say individuals, but sometimes members of the public think of them as characters. With Capital Insight, though, I hope people develop the idea that we have real human beings who have real missions in government, who are trying to do the right things even though we may not always agree with what they're doing. As we run these programs, we try to talk a little bit about the background of our guests and then develop some information about some of the projects that they're involved in. Our guest today is a gentleman who was first elected to the Oregon House of Representatives in 1988, representing the Salem area, Representative Gene Derfler, now representing West and Southwest Salem as a member of the House of Representatives. Welcome to Capital Insight.
Thank you very much for having me, Kevin.
Well, we're glad to have you here today. We've talked a little bit about some of the things that you and I have dealt with before, but I think it's good for the members of the audience to understand a little bit more about you as a person. I happen to know that during World War II you served in the Navy as a pilot. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, I did. I grew up on a farm in Southwest Washington, and I did enter the service back in 1942, and did serve as a Navy pilot during the war. After the war, I worked for a large corporation, Firestone, for about 7 years, and got what I feel is a pretty good background in retailing. And at that point, started our own business in Salem called Nyko Furniture, and we had that business for some 28 years. And I think became sort of a major store in Salem. Sold out to Smith's in 1982, and then got involved in the legislature and have enjoyed it very much.
Now, you've done some real estate work too, as I understand.
Yes, I am a real estate broker. I took on real estate after I sold the store, trying to find something that was satisfying, and I did enjoy it, and I still do it, as a matter of fact, but I do find more excitement, of course, in the legislature.
Well, we have a tension always existing. We have a citizen legislature, so we expect our legislators to have private lives and private occupations, and then to serve as legislators during session and during committee meetings and the like. Have you been always trying to address that tension in terms of your activities?
You know, it's interesting you'd ask that, and I don't quite understand how people do hold a normal job and work in the legislature. I found the legislature to be very demanding in time and effort. So I admire people that can hold a steady job, and like yourself, and still do a good job in the legislature. I could never have done that in the business that I had. I find that I am able to still do some real estate work, but as the majority of my time is taken up with constituent work and, of course, my children's care issues that we're addressing.
Well, as far as the legislature goes, you ran in 1988. That was your first race, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
How did you find campaigning at that time?
Well, it was exciting. It's kind of like running a race. You never know till the last minute whether you're going to win or lose. So it's a challenge. It's much like I find running a business. You make a plan and make the plan happen. And it takes a lot of organization and a lot of hard work. I think there's a great deal more effort and work that goes into it than most people ever realize.
What made you decide to run for the legislature in the first place?
I think it was sort of a natural progression. I've been involved in a lot of community activities in Salem for a number of years. I was president, I was the first president of the Salem Transit Board when the transit system was formed. I served 4 years as chairman of Juvenile Services Commission in Marion County. I was active in the YMCA, the Boys Club, Chamber of Commerce, and it was sort of a natural progression that I would go from that area into government and representation.
Were there some things about the legislature, once you were there and serving, you began serving in January of '89, that surprised you, that were different from what you expected?
It was a complete learning experience for me. I had never been involved in government before and really didn't understand the formation, didn't understand the process, and it was a real learning experience for me.
Well, running up through the 1989 session, now you were re-elected in 1990 and served during the 1991 session. And in those two sessions, are there any particular things that come to mind that you're most proud of, that you recall as accomplishments? I know you served as chair of the House Labor Committee in the last session.
Well, I think that one of the reasons that I ran for office, of course, was to try to correct workers' compensation. And I think I was instrumental in working with that program and making some of the things happen. There was a great deal of us, as you know, that were involved in that, and it took all of us to make it happen. But I think that we all should be pretty proud of what we accomplished in the reform of workers' compensation. We've certainly have helped the injured worker get better benefits, and we certainly have cut the costs for businesses, which I think helping the economy of the state so that businesses can create jobs, so that our children that graduate from high school and colleges can find work in our state is really the key to the success for our state.
Let me shift you a little bit now to the interim. Since we finished up our 1991 session, it's been almost a year now we've been out of session, except for a one-day special session in regard to the governor's tax proposal. During that interim, what kind of activity have you been engaged in?
Well, it's been a rather exciting interim for me. As you know, the governor met with leadership after the last session and tried to come up with some kind of a program that would show the people of the state that we can be more efficient, we can provide better services for less dollars. And the speaker, of course, Larry Campbell, was involved in that and chose to take a look at the children's issues, how we provide services for families and children in our state. He asked me if I would chair a task force that would perhaps review that and come up with some suggestions. And that's been a very exciting process for me. We spent a great deal of time working with it. Perhaps I've been spending 30 hours a week on it, so it's a very intensive program. We started meeting last September, and I think we have a very interesting makeup of our task force. We started out realizing that if we were going to make changes, we had to get it through the legislature. And so we made up a task force starting with 6 members of the House and 6 members of the Senate. And we tried very hard to keep it a bipartisan so that the politics wouldn't get involved in it. And we had equal representation of both parties. And we tried to get representation geographically so that we didn't have any conflicts there. So we have a good makeup of legislators in it. We also chose 6 business people, and the 6 business people that we chose were people that were involved in the major restructuring of corporations in Oregon. We didn't pick CEOs, we didn't pick owners of the companies, but people that were really involved in change. And then we also got on the committee 6 advocates for children, and then we got 6 professionals that were involved in sort of the entry points into the system.
I'm going to ask you to pause for a moment and tell me, with that many people involved, it sounds like you're up to about 30?
We had 30 people.
With that many people involved, did you find it unwieldy to get them together to deal with the issues?
It was quite unwieldy at times, but we had an excellent professional group, and I think that they were very intent on making improvements in the system. And even though we had disagreements, we had very good discussions, and I think we've come to some good conclusions.
Have you finished the work of the task force, or are you in the process of finishing
We're
it?
still in the process. We have completed our inventory of looking at what we have, and we've also looked at what we would like to have. And we have written our first draft for legislative work, and we have not had the final drafts signed off by the task force yet. And we still have a lot of work to do in that we have to come up with a PR program to educate the public, and we also have to have an implementation team to take us from where we are to where we want to get. So there's still much work to do, but we have accomplished a lot toward that goal.
Do you have a facilitator or executive who works with you to kind of keep all of this tied together, or is it committee staff or what?
We have committee staff. We did get an appropriation for the staff, and very excellent people, by the way, and they've really helped us in formulating this. We did have a facilitator for our first few meetings to get us going down the right track, but since then we've pretty much gone on our own.
As far as this process goes, it sounds to me like an example of the kinds of things we can do in the interim. And when we say interim, we mean the time between regular sessions of the legislature. There's usually a year-and-a-half gap before we're back into full-time session for 6 months, since we meet every 2 years. What are your reflections so far in this process? Has this been time well spent in trying to develop these?
Yes, it is. It was interesting for me to take a look at what's happened over the past few years. But I found out in looking at the program that we have had 11 audits of CSD since 1985, but we have never made any changes. And what happens is the audits are done, and the reports are written, and they are put on a shelf, and they collect dust, basically, and there are not changes made. The last task force that met in '89 was also a 30-member task force, and their task was to try to work together and make the system less fragmented so that services could be coordinated. We ended up with a very thick book that's on the shelf with really not much recommendations in it, in my opinion. But we did find out one thing, that we have 238 children's programs, and they're being served in 37 different agencies in the state. And it's a very fragmented system. It certainly is not the agency's problem. Really the problem is the legislative and executive department.
I'm going to interrupt for a minute to mention as a break for our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix, and our guest is Representative Gene Derfler from Salem, a state representative since January of 1989. And what we're talking about right now is a special task force that Representative Derfler chairs dealing with children's issues. And again, you're with us on Capital Insight. If you ever have any questions or concerns, feel free to write to me, Representative Kevin Mannix, at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. We always welcome your questions and concerns. And now, picking up from that interruption, we were just talking about the agencies, the number of agencies, and you were mentioning it's really a legislative and executive challenge to pull these fragmented programs. Was it 238 that you
238
mentioned?
programs and 37 agencies.
Now, do you think these other reviews and audits and task force studies in the past, their reports have gathered dust because basically they didn't have an implementation plan to follow through on their commentary, or what?
I think that the difference is that the audits or the reviews have always been done by the professionals or by the bureaucrats. And they never included the legislature, and that was one of the things that I really looked at in forming this task force. I knew if we were going to make changes, we had to get it to the legislature, and that was the main reason why we included 6 members from each chamber. I think it's important, and I think that if changes need to be made, I think if people took a look at that and included legislators in their planning process, they probably would accomplish a lot more.
Is this partially because the legislators get educated by the process?
Sure. They buy into the program, and once they understand it. You see, I've always said legislators are not special people. We're just ordinary people, and we're there to try to do a job. But unless we become educated and understand the issues, we can't really make good laws. And it does take a lot of time, a lot of education from a lot of people to help us understand the issues so that we can make good decisions.
Has the task force developed a lot of consensus about a lot of the issues that have arisen in the provisional?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the thing that we have found is that most of our dollars are being spent on the far end of the spectrum. Some of the studies that we found, we had Dr. Brazelton from Harvard out, spoke to us. He told us that he can interview a 9-month-old child and tell whether that child is going to be a success or failure that early in life. The study done in child development at the University of Oregon tells us that unless we address the problems that children have by the time they're in the 3rd grade, the dollars that we spend after that are really not well spent. We accomplish very little with the dollars we spend. So obviously, we spend most all of our dollars on the remedial end of the spectrum. As an example, it costs us about $157 a day to keep a child in Hillcrest or McLaren. If we could spend $157 a day prenatally and prevent that from happening, it would be a lot more effective. We spend very few of our dollars on the beginning of life. We spend it most in the remedial.
So we've got we've got a back-loaded system rather than a front-loaded system. It sounds like a good deal of the attention comes about because the symptoms of the problems begin to express themselves as kids get older and become more independent. Those symptoms have been masked or not recognized or just not dealt with because the kids weren't old enough to be all that aggressive early on.
Well, we never address a problem until there is a problem, and that usually happens to a child when he's in the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And as I pointed out, if you don't correct those deficiencies early in life, the dollars you spend after that are not too effective. And until the child acts out or becomes involved in the system, we never react to it. We're not in a preventive mode at all.
And you mentioned there are 37 agencies involved in provision of children's programs.
It's a very, very fragmented system. The system was developed over a period of years, but primarily was developed maybe 50 years ago. And when we had a whole different set of problems. Today we have a different set of problems than we had that many years ago. And we find that a family who has a problem may be going to 5 or 6 or 7 different agencies to get service. And those agencies all have different intake forms. They all have different criteria for providing services. They have computers that don't communicate with each other. And so a family may be going to CSD, Children's Services, and it may be going to Adult and Family Services, and it may be going to Drug and Alcohol Treatment. And none of those agencies talk to each other and know what the other one's doing.
Are your recommendations going to include synthesizing this operation so that you've got, in effect, a child welfare or family welfare agency that you go to and they coordinate all of the services?
Well, not quite that. In fact, we've come to the conclusion as a group that state agencies as a whole do not perhaps provide good services for families. It becomes too bureaucratic and not sensitive to the needs of the families. And we believe that if we can transfer the responsibility back to the communities and convince communities that they have to be responsible for those kids, that those kids belong to them, and it's not a state problem but a local community problem, that we can correct it by getting more people involved with children and families without spending more dollars and do a much more effective job.
Do you have some programmatic proposals for how that shift would occur?
Yes, we've come up with a design where we feel like the state ought to be doing the high-intensity work, such as the Children Protective Agencies, where they make sure that children are protected and provide the services, perhaps like at Hillcrest and at McLaren, but and then beyond that, just help the local communities develop programs as they need them in those communities to be effective.
I should mention Hillcrest and McLaren, Hillcrest School for Girls and McLaren School for Boys. You can even get the idea, the old-fashioned idea out of their names for the, I'll call them the old-fashioned term, juvenile delinquents, who are actually now are juvenile, the level of people who go into those institutions are usually juvenile criminals.
That's correct.
Have you taken a look at how juvenile corrections interfaces with the corrections system itself? Or is that something that's sort of beyond the process?
No, I think one thing that we found in getting involved and learning about the system, the 2 areas that we really need to address that we didn't start out to address was the court system. Presently, I believe we have the same problem in our court system that we have in our agency system, and that's that we have an adult court and we have a juvenile court. And again, the family may be involved in both courts and neither of them are talking to each other, so neither knows what the other one is doing. And I certainly am going to encourage and try to develop a family court system, introduce a bill perhaps that will make a family court. A lot of the judges don't like that because the status of being in a domestic court or family court is not as great as being in a regular court system. And so the judges have resisted that kind of a change, but I think that's something we really need to take a look at. I think we also need to take a look at our education system. You know, House Bill 3565, I think, was developed, and we're talking about earlier intervention in that area also.
We should mention that that bill was the bill which has sort of redesigned the education system for Oregon over the next 10 to 20 years, so that ultimately we're going to be taking a revolutionary look at education in Oregon.
And I think education would be the logical place for social services to end up because that's where the kids are. But I find most educators are thinking in terms of 6 to 18, and we need to change their thinking from 0 to 18, that we start educating our children from the time they're born and not starting just when they're 6.
Let me pause for a moment again for our audience and mention that you are with us on Capital Insight. This is a regular program designed to give members of the audience some insight into the players in the Capitol and the programs that are being dealt with. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix. I'm your host, and our guest today is Representative Gene Derfler from Salem, and we've been talking about a revamped look at programs for children and families in the state of Oregon. Representative Derfler is chairing a task force which is developing a report for presentation to the legislature and to state government. Picking up on what you were just talking about, Gene, you were talking about understanding that education begins at the very beginning, actually, in terms of the family environment. What kinds of programs are you contemplating in those preschool years? A state version of Head Start or what?
Yeah, I think that we need to even start before that, and even in the prenatal area where we have again, we don't have normal families anymore as we have. We find that, as an example, 26% of the families are single-parent families. And these single-parent families don't just develop. In other words, you don't go down a neighborhood and say every fourth house is a single parent. You'll find that you go in some areas in Salem, you maybe only find 1 out of 8 or 9 families that are single-parent. Where you go in another area, maybe you find 6 out of 10 are. Because these people seem to congregate in areas because of economic reasons. Most single-parent families earn 30 to 40% of an income that a two-parent family does. And it's quite logical when you think about it. Most two-parent families, both parents work. And so you immediately have doubled your income there. You also find that most single-parent families are predominantly women. And women earn less than men in the workplace. So you understand that their income is maybe only 30 to 40% of a normal family. And if I were to ask you to reduce your income by 60 or 70% and live a lifestyle that you have, you'd find that you couldn't do that. And so I think if you go by Maslow's theory that until you address the basic needs of people, and that is a place to sleep and clothing and food, you're probably not going to do too well in a learning process. So
Aren't you worried that you're beginning to sound like a Democratic liberal?
Oh, that's terrible, isn't it? Well, again, I think it's money well spent if we can provide an opportunity for people to be self-sustaining early in life and create families that are self-sustaining. It's going to take care of us economically in the state.
That's an investment in our future, too.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about the prenatal health care. As you're talking here, it sounds like your task force is talking about a family resource center at the local level where
absolutely
a woman goes in and says, I'm pregnant. Now what do I do? Where can I get health care and so forth?
I think our goal is to have family resource centers in the communities where they can go in and it doesn't stigmatize them, that they can go in for any reason, get parenting classes, get immunization shots, perhaps a respite care for some family that needs some time off, perhaps a clothing bank for clothing for children. And a lot of that would be done through volunteers. They could also get some drug and alcohol treatment and some just basic needs. And we would see the family resource centers perhaps being available wherever a grade school is. Maybe not even at a grade school or at least close to a grade school. We're obviously not going to start out that way, but that would be sort of our goal.
Are you worried about running into resistance from what I'll call the traditional welfare bureaucrats? People say, well, wait a minute, we're going to have our welfare offices, and that's where people go for that help, or you can apply for food stamps, or you can go to County Medical Association or some sort of operation for
that's exactly
healthcare.
The system that we have today. It's a very fragmented system, and you can't get, you know, one of the experiences we had in the task force is we gave each one a actual case and said, you go out and find the services that would be needed for that case. And we didn't tell them where to go or how to go. Well, if you can imagine, these people who are well educated, and many of them familiar with the system, had difficulty finding where to go to get services. Can you imagine a family who is disadvantaged that has to go to 5 or 6 different places to get those services? We want the services to be a one-stop shop center.
Well, that seems to parallel what we're trying to do with businesses, the contractors and the like, people who want to do business in the state. We've been talking about giving them one-stop places for licensing. And your focus then is, in terms of families and children, we need to have one-stop services for help.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. and where it's not stigmatizing. One of the problems we have, as you know, with children's services, and I'm sure you experience the same thing I do, you get a lot of complaints about them, is because they are a police agency as well as a healing case, and it's very difficult for them to play both roles. And people will not go to children's services on a voluntary basis.
Well, they're worried about the stigma. Well, CSD
Absolutely.
is involved. That means I must have been abusing my child either sexually or physically or somehow, or very much neglecting the child. Are you thinking of changing the role then in sense of the family, I'll call it the Family Resource Center being the proactive helping organization, but when abuse is identified, did you bring in the state agency, and it might even call it again the Children's Protection Division or whatever, which says, yeah, we're here, and have them intervene very strongly and have it an early intervention where you say right now, this is obviously such a bad situation, we need to pull the child out, or it's not too bad and we can help within the home environment.
One of the things we did on the committee is we tried to look at it through the eyes of the people that need the services or want the services. And we even come to the conclusion that that person probably should design or help design their own system, their own program to get them out of poverty and into a work experience and into a self-sustaining family again. And so we're trying to build on the strengths of the people, not always looking at the problems. We need to take a look at some of the positive things that they can do and build on those positive things so that they can, as you know, the biggest problem we have, these families, is a self-esteem. And if we can make them successful and get them back into the American dream mode, they will be successful and they'll progress and become self-sustaining.
As I see this, if you've got the, I'll call it the kernel of caring, you've got the parent or parents who care about the children. They may not be capable, very well capable for whatever reasons, and they may need help with that, but they want to do the right thing. Those are the people that will be helped by the Family Resource Center. On the other hand, you have some people who are pretty nasty, bad parents who have been abusing their kids and who may be beyond the pale. Those are the kinds of folks who say, well, wait a minute, look, first thing we have to do is protect these kids, and we're going to have the state protective agency in there and you know, protect those kids, get them out of that environment. Is this sort of the drift we're talking about?
Yes, I think that again, I think local communities can do that, can locate the needs and identify what services are necessary, and in a lot of cases provide those services right in the community. But when it gets beyond the acceptable standards, then of course the state will have to come in and provide a different source or a different place for those kids to live until the corrections can be made.
I just wanted to make sure that our audience understood that we're not talking about taking some abusive parent who's been sexually abusing a child and saying, gee, there, we're just going to pat you on the back and bring you to the Family Resources Center. That's a different kind of situation than the parent who doesn't know a lot about hygiene and clothing and where to go for help and that sort of thing.
I think basically all parents want to be good parents. They want things better for their children. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but I think as a rule most people are good people and they really don't understand how to raise a family. I'm sure you and I probably made a lot of mistakes that I know I did raising my family. So none of us start out knowing how to do that. And so helping people, and there's been a lot of research and study on human development in the last few years that I think we understand more. It's very difficult for children when you remove them from their homes. Sometimes we remove them much too soon, sometimes much too late. As I think you probably are aware that we've had something like 10 or 12 deaths of small children already this year, which is, you know, it's just not proper. And those things we need to eliminate. But a lot of times we remove children from homes
just on accusations.
On accusations and no proof, and that's very traumatic for the kids also.
Well, we only have a few seconds left, so I'll have to wrap this up. But by mentioning it, obviously your task force will have a report to present.
We will have legislation pre-filed for the session. We are very serious about making changes.
Well, I look forward to working with you on it.
Great.
And I appreciate your joining us today for Capital Insight. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. Our guest has been Representative Gene Derfler from Salem, talking a little bit about himself at the beginning of the show and then a lot about a project that he obviously very much believes in, revamping the provision of children's services. Thank you for joining us. Paid for and authorized by Citizens for Mannix, 2003 State Street, Salem, Oregon, 97301.